So today I'll talk about employee participation in corporations from a law and economics perspective. So actually, this is part of my PhD thesis, and I just submitted my thesis to the assessment committee last month, and I hope to get it defended maybe in a few months, then get it published after that. So today's presentation, it's also part of a forthcoming book chapter that will be published by the end of this year. So it's a book chapter from a edited collection from the Polish Law and Economics Association. So apart from the book chapter, I'll talk about the story of China since I'm here at the Chinese Law Center. So I'll also talk about some practice in China. So first, the research background of the book chapter that will get published by the end of this year, and also all these general economic justifications and the effects of employee participation. Then I'll talk about why regulates, because I'll talk about the possible positive effects of employee participation. Then the people might ask, if it has so many positive effects, why the regulations in most countries, why most countries will use regulations to regulate employee participation, but rather they would arise automatically and spontaneously. So that's why we need regulation. So the last point will be the story of China, and there will be two parts. So that's also the main findings of my PhD thesis. So the main rationales of the Chinese context and how to regulate employee participation, and will also be the comparison between China and Germany. Yeah, because my PhD thesis also compares the practice of employee participation between China and Germany. So let's look at the research background. So for the from the law and economics perspective, the businesses, they often and commonly face agency problems. So that is when agents will act on behalf of their interests rather than those interests of principals. And typically there are three types of agency problems, mainly between the shareholders and the managers, and between the minority shareholders and majority shareholders, and between stakeholders and the firm itself. And I'll elaborate on these agency problems later, and we just have a general topic picture here. And then there would be two major strategies to address agency problems, namely regulatory strategies and governance strategies. I'll also elaborate on these strategies later. But we must know that these strategies can be summarized as carrots and sticks. So carrots means incentives, and the sticks means monitoring and constraints. So a typical mechanism that to address agency problems can be summarized as sticks and carrots and sticks, and that's a mechanism that combines incentives with monitoring and constraints. So then for employee participation, that's a mechanism through which employees can share in the fruits of the business, or they can participate in corporate management. So the typical model, and Jed also mentioned that employee stock ownership plan, employee ownership, so that they can share in the fruits of business, and also board level employee representation. So employees, they can participate in corporate boards and then participate in corporate management, decision making, and supervision. And all these employee participation mechanisms can also be regarded as an approach of carrots and sticks. So that's the main research background of that book chapter. Then we talk about, so then based on this research background, I raised the research question in that book chapter, that is, what are the effects of employee participation, and what is the economic justifications for employee participation? So to answer this research question, we first look at the forms of employee participation that I just mentioned that earlier. So employee participation is a mechanism by which employees can share in the fruits of the business or participate in corporate management. Therefore, employee participation can be divided into management participation and financial participation. So management participation means that employees can participate in corporate management, which can be divided into direct participation and indirect participation. So for direct participation, it means that employees can directly express their views and propose their proposals to their superiors directly through daily communications. But for indirect participation, it means that employees, they need to participate in corporate management through representatives. For example, board level employee representation. So I've given an example here. For example, in China, that the newly adopted company law that just came into force last year, it stipulates that for companies with more than 300 employees, there can be employee representatives on the board of directors. For the supervisory board, 1/3 member of the board members must be employee representatives. So that's what we call board level employee representation. And for the case in Germany, that it's mandatory for most companies to have employee representatives on their supervisory boards. And the second form of indirect participation is trade unions. So the trade unions will act on behalf of their members and negotiate for better working conditions and better working welfare with the employers. So in this case, that the trade unions they act on behalf of their members, so there's also a form of indirect participation. And for financial participation, the first form is profit sharing. So it's mainly through like the annual bonuses or the one-time awards that the employer will grant to the employees based on their performance. That's mainly in the form of the cash. But for the employees, the ownership plans, that's employees, they can acquire the stocks in their corporations and they become shareholders. And in most cases, that those employee shareholders, and they can participate in the shareholders' meetings. In this case, they can also participate in corporate decision making. So in this case, that the financial participation can also be integrated into the form of management participation. Yeah, because through shareholders meetings, employee shareholders, they can also participate in corporate decision making. Okay. So based on that, we can look at how employees may get involved in agency problems. And before that, we have introduced the typical agency problems in corporations. There are 3 typical types of agency problems. So the first is between the owners, and normally the shareholders, and between the managers. In this case, the owners, they will be the principal. The managers will be the agent. So the managers, they could steal or fraud from the shareholders, and they can pursue their personal interests rather than the interest of the shareholders. And the second is between minority shareholders and majority shareholders. In this case, the minority shareholders will be the principal and the majority shareholders will be the agent. So because in many cases, the majority shareholders, they will have the final say of corporate decision making and management. So it could be the case that they could just simply ignore the opinions of the majority shareholders and to pursue their own and to maximize their personal interests. And the last agency problem is between employees and the firm itself. And in almost book chapter, that they argue that this is a one-direction agency problem. So in this case, the firm will squeeze and exploit the employees. For example, the firm can simply ask the employees to work overtime without paying enough compensation to the employees. So this is how the firm could exploit and squeeze the employees. But then in my book chapter and also in my PhD thesis, I argue that the third type of agency problem, that it works both ways. So not only the firm could squeeze and exploit the employees, but employees could also shirk and steal from the company. For example, the employees, they could just steal the properties, the assets from the company without being noticed to the employers. So this is how the third type of agency problem can work both ways between employees and the firm itself. And then through employee participation, namely that I just mentioned, the board-level employee representation and employee stock ownership plans. Through the two types of employee participation, that employees, they could also get involved in the first and second type of agency problems. For example, when employees they enter the board of directors, they will inevitably get involved into the agency problem between the shareholders and the managers. And then through employee stock ownership plans, when they become employee shareholders and they go to the shareholders meetings, and normally they become the minority shareholders. In this case, they will also get involved in the agency problem between minority shareholders and majority shareholders. So in this case, they're actually employees. It's possible for employees to get involved in all three types of agency problems. So if employees they would get involved in agency problems, then I will argue that it's also possible for employee participation to address these agency problems. So I just mentioned that there will be generally two strategies to address agency problems: regulatory strategies and governance strategies. So for regulatory strategies, that means that it focuses on the direct supervision and control of agents' behavior through legislation. So mainly like through the company law, the labor law, or trade union law to regulate the behavior of agents. For governance strategies, that means that usually to enhance the principal's internal control over the agent through contracts and other corporate governance strategies rather than through law. And also one combination of strategies to address agency problem is the carrots and sticks. So with the carrots refer to the incentives, for example, employee stock ownership plans to align the interests between employees and the employer. And also the sticks referring to monitoring and constraints. And I will elaborate on these strategies in the slide. So how employee participation may reduce agency problems. So for example, that the agency problem normally arise because of the conflicts of interest between agents and principals. So through board-level employee representation, it can reduce the information asymmetry and reduce the conflicts of interest between the firm and its employees. For example, employees, they have the daily operation information of the corporation they work for. So if they enter the board of directors, they could share this information with the boards. So therefore, it could alleviate the information asymmetry from the employee to the firm. And moreover, that when employees they enter the board of directors, that they could get the micro information of the financial situation and the operation plans of the corporation they work for. So therefore, they will also have a better understanding of the macro objectives of their corporations. So in this case, that they will feel they might have a better understanding of their situation in the corporation, so that we could also help to better align the interests between employees and their firms. And for the employee stock ownership plans, it can tie the personal interests of the employees to the interests of their corporations. So for example, if employees they can get the stocks of their corporations, that the logic is that if they work harder, that the corporation could perform better. So in many cases, if the corporation performs better, that their stock price will increase. And the employee shareholders can benefit from the rising stock price. So in this case, that the employee shareholders could also benefit from employee stock ownership plans. And this is how employee stock ownership plan can align the interests between employees and employers. And then moreover, employee participation can also reduce the information asymmetry between managers and shareholders through internal monitoring mechanisms. So this is mainly through the board level employee representation. So not only the employees, when they get into the board of directors, they can have more information on the general objectives and also like the financial situation of their corporations, but also they can monitor the behavior of the managers and the board and the directors, because they can just observe their behavior of the meetings, on the meetings of the board of directors. So in this case, if the corporation can incentivize or encourage the employees to, for example, to report the frauds and steal of the managers and the directors, to report those behavior to the shareholders, that it could be the case that it can enhance the internal monitoring mechanism in the corporation. So, so this is how employee participation can address agency problems. So of course, there are also other possible effects of employee participation. So for the advantages, we just explained how it could address or reduce agency problems, and also it can build a better or improve the labor relations. For example, if employees' voice can be heard through more channels for employee participation, it could be the case that it could reduce the conflicts between employees and employers. So therefore, it could reduce employee turnover if their voice can be heard more frequently, and it could also reduce the strike rates if they could just express how they wanted to be treated in their corporations and what benefits they want to have from their corporations through employee participation. It could also reduce the rates of strike because they have more channel to negotiate. It could also improve firm performance. So through the empirical literature that, for example, employee stock ownership plans could improve firm profitability and improve firm productivity and increased firm value. So that's got approved and confirmed through empirical literature. So generally speaking, the advantages of employee participation include reducing agency problems, improving labor relations, and improving firm performance. Of course, there are also possible challenges and drawbacks that could face by employee participation. First, agency problems. So it's interesting because not only employee participation could reduce agency problems, but it might also increase agency problems. For example, when employees they enter the board of directors, the corporation can encourage them to report the fraud behavior of the managers, but also the managers may choose to collude with employees to steal together from the firm, from the shareholders. So in this case, there will be another way of another form of agency problems. So managers, directors, and employees, they work together to steal from the corporation. And also the free riding problem. It's the case that so for example, for employee stock ownership plans, if there are many employees that could participate in employee stock ownership plans, it could be the case that the individual efforts of one employee may not have very significant influence on overall firm performance. So in this case, many employees, they may simply choose not to work hard, but to rely on the working efforts of other employees, than to enjoy the benefits that are created by those other employees. So that's what we call free riding problems, because they could just simply rely on other employee shareholders' efforts, but not their own efforts. And also decision-making inefficiency. In this case, that employees, they could simply choose to, if they don't have the enough information and enough knowledge to perform their duties as employee representatives, it could be difficult for them to really make good decisions, or it could be the case that it could delay the decision-making procedures if they are not competent to act as employee representatives in the case of management participation. And also there will be financial risks. So not only that the employee participation, especially the employees' ownership plans, could improve firm productivity or increase the firm's stock price. It could also be the case that, especially when the economy is not going well, like for the corporate will get downsizing or will get laid off, that the employees they might get laid off. But not only to that, it could also be the case that the stock price of their firm will decrease. So it's not always the case that they could benefit from the rising stock price, but if the stock price get increased, it would also bad for their financial returns for employee shareholders. So there could also be the challenges and drawbacks of employee participation. Therefore, for many empirical literature, they also argue that employee participation not always generates positive results. And they will argue that the employee participation might not be good at all for corporations. And in my thesis and also in my book chapter, I argue that because not all the corporations, they can adjust their employee participation policies up to date. So it could be difficult for the scholars to observe the positive effects of these corporations. So that's why in many empirical literature, they might not observe positive effects of employee participation. Okay. Then we're back to the question that we raised in the beginning. So if employee participation is very good, it's a potential solution to agency problems. So why in many countries they will just issue the regulations to regulate employee participation, but not the other way, that the employee participation could just arise automatically and spontaneously in corporations and they could work very well. So the Coase theorem indicates that the efficient solution to an externality problem will only be reached by private parties if the transaction costs are low enough. And in the case that when employees and corporations, when they negotiate the specific details of employee participation, they will face high transaction costs. For example, the transaction costs include search and information costs, bargaining and decision costs, policy and enforcement costs. So for search and information costs, so it will cost employees and employers to find out exactly how to implement employee participation, and it will cost them time and money. And for bargaining and decision costs, of course, they need to bargain in the details and on how to implement employee participation. And in this case, that often employees, they would be in the weak position against employers. So they could not always have a very favorable conditions in terms of employee participation. It could be the case that although employers, they implement the policies of employee participation, it's more favorable to the interests of the corporations, but not to the interests of employees. And also the policy and enforcement costs. So to make sure that employee participation policies can be implemented and in the way that both employees and employers will like, it will cost a lot, because normally the employees, it will be difficult for employees to monitor or to constrain how employers implement employee participation policies. So that would be the cost of enforcement. So therefore, it could be difficult for both employees and employers to reach a efficient solution or an efficient agreement for employee participation. So in this case, that when employee participation does not arise spontaneously due to high transaction costs, it may be necessary for the government to intervene in the form of regulatory strategies. So in this case, in the form of regulations. So that's why the government may need to issue the regulations to regulate employee participation. Okay, so that's the economic justifications for employee participation. Okay, so now I'll introduce the main findings of my PhD thesis. So first it's a brief comparison between China and Germany on employee participation. So employee participation in both countries include management participation and financial participation. In this case, so for example, in China, we have the board level employee representation. I just mentioned that in the company law, we will have employee representatives on the board of directors and on the supervisory board. And for financial participation, we have the employee stock ownership plans, that especially after 2013, that the central government decided to promote the ESOPs in the mixed ownership reform. And in Germany, they also have management participation and financial participation. So for example, for management participation, they have the system called co-determination, that is employees can determine on corporate management issues with through the supervisory board. And for financial participation, that I found that in Germany, they would prefer the form of profit sharing. So not in China, they would prefer we prefer the form of employee stock ownership plans, and also the government, like the Securities Commission, and also the central government issues some government documents to regulate ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. But in Germany, I did not observe this practice of employee stock ownership plans. And then both countries have adopted their legal frameworks for management participation to strengthen the possibilities to monitor agents and the possibilities to constrain the opportunistic behavior of those agents. So I argue that in both countries, in China and Germany, they both use the carrots and sticks methods to regulate employee participation. Then I also found that there's more regulation on management participation than on financial participation in both countries. So for example, in China, we have the company law, we have trade union law, we have labor law and labor contract law to regulate management participation. For example, board level employee representation and the staff and workers representative congress. We have all these regulations. But like for the financial participation for employee stock ownership plans, we only have some government documents to regulate the implementation details, but not laws, except like for in the company law, we said that the companies can buy their share back and to distribute those shares to employee stock ownership plans. But this is not the implementation details of employee stock ownership plans. And in the case of Germany, that they have, for example, the 1/3 determination, 1/3 participation act to regulate that the 1/3 of the members of the supervisory board must be employee representatives. So they also use the regulation to regulate management participation. But for financial participation in Germany, they only have some kind of favorable clauses in, for example, the income tax law. That how so if employees they get the benefits because of the rising stock price of the stocks they acquire in the corporations, they could exempt for a definite percent, exempt from their income, to exempt from the tax. So, therefore, there's not really a specific laws that regulates financial participation in both countries. And then the degree of employee participation in both countries include information, communication, consultation, and co-determination, but their practice are different. For example, for information, that employees they can get information of the daily operation of their corporations, and they could communicate with their superiors, with the managers through employee participation, and also they can make proposals to express their opinions through employee representation, and also they can co-decide, what we call co-determination, to co-decide corporate management issues with their corporations. So in this case, in the two countries, the degree of employee participation can mainly the same, just the practices are different. Then it's the story of China. So management participation in China can be traced back to the political commitments made by the Communist Party of China at its inception in 1921, that the workers should participate in corporate management and ultimately in the governance of the country. So for example, when the CPC was founded in 1921, it used the labor movement to encourage the workers to strike against the imperialism, the federalism of the country, so mainly opposite of the Kuomintang. And then after the CPC gained power in many bases, in many revolutionary bases after 1921, and also during the war against Japan, they no longer implement the labor movements in the CPC governed areas, but they encourage the workers to participate in factory management. So therefore, in China, the practice of employee participation that promoted by the CPC changed gradually after it gained power in the bases, and also after the founding of the country. So therefore, between 1921 and 1949, that in the non-CPC governed areas, that the CPC will promote strikes and labor movement against the other party. Then in the CPC governed areas, that the CPC will encourage workers to participate in corporate management through, for example, the factory committees. There is the factory management committees that the workers' representatives and the factory directors, they could decide together on the factory management matters. And then to today, that in the constitution law of China, that it's called the people should be the master of the country. So in my thesis, I argue that this is also the expression of employee participation in China, because that it promised that the workers, they should participate in the corporate management. And after the CPC seized power of the country, the working class will have the power to manage the country. So therefore, employee participation in China also called democratic management, 民主管理. So in China, it also has the political meanings that the employees, they should they could participate in management of the country through participate in the management of their corporations, especially through the management of state-owned enterprises. And then also for the case of financial participation is also a necessity for socialist democracy in China, as well as for the promotion of the socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. So for the socialist democracy, because that especially for a long time that we call that the working people are the master of the country, and the working people, they should work in state-owned enterprises as if they are the owners of these enterprises. So employee stock ownership plans is a way that employees, they can really be the owners of their corporations. So it's part of the way that employees, they could also participate in corporate management. And also for the promotion of the socialist market economy, well, especially after the 1978, that China implemented the reform and opening up policy, that generally China implemented a stockholding reform. So at the time, many state-owned enterprises will be partially privatized. They changed their so in this case that the state-owned share didn't have the majority or didn't have the full control of their state-owned enterprises, but like they encouraged the private investors to buy the shares of the SOE. So in this case, that the SOEs, the ownership structure of the SOE will be the state-owned shares, employee shares, and like the investor shares. So, but in many cases, that the state-owned shares still had the control, still in the control position of the SOEs. But in this case, is that the employee stock ownership plan is a way that the CPC tried to change the ownership structure of those state-owned enterprises, and especially after 2013, that we launched a new round of the ownership reform of state-owned enterprises, 混合所有制改革. So in this case, that the CPC encouraged state-owned enterprises to include more like the private investors or strategic investors to buy the stocks, the shares of the SOEs. So to improve the ownership structure of those SOEs. So in this case, the financial participation in China also bears some political objectives in its implementation. And I also found that employee participation usually relies on policies promoted by the CPC to serve political and economic objectives. So normally the CPC will express its opinions on a particular employee participation policy, and usually in the form of the pilot's implementation in some SOEs first. And if those practices were successful, that the CPC will introduce those practices to more SOEs, and at the end of the day, to the whole country. So that's how these policies will ultimately be implemented in the form of laws or government documents that have the legal force for all corporations in the country. So it reflects the feature of the CPC as the code of leadership in Chinese socialism, because most employee participation policies, they were first introduced by the CPC through like the national meetings, the national congresses, like that. And finally, that those policies will be implemented as in the laws and the regulations or in the government documents, and then finally can be implemented throughout the country. Okay, yeah, that's the presentation of today. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, so thank you for sharing that. And before we I'll sort of take the chair's prerogative, I'll ask sort of like two sets of questions. One related to the basic agency story tied to employee ownership, and then one set of questions related to the China-specific trajectory. So the first thing is that sort of like Hansman's traditional critique, right, of employee ownership is not just that there are these sort of like agency issues that might crop up in employee participation, but that employees themselves are heterogeneous, right? There's a wide variety of employees. The employees aren't a singular category. They might have a lot of different interests. And I wonder if this is there are and under that story there are natural employee-owned corporations. They're just called partnerships, right? Like law firms, right? Are the example traditionally you're right. You have a very small group of people with very homogeneous interests. They themselves, right, can exert that type of decision making as sort of like a unitary body. Nowadays, if you sort of fast forward, especially in the US and the mainland and everywhere, you have sort of like the rise of precarious work and sort of issues with like employee classification. Who is actually an employee of a company, right? The number of like ride sharing and other types of dissertations that have been written here and elsewhere are quite high. So how does sort of like the change in the nature of work seems to undermine the sort of ability of employee ownership to operate, because now we have a variety of categories of employees, right? They're not just diverse, right, as regular employees, but they have different legal relationships, right? Increasingly tenuous relationship to individual companies. So that's one side. We have the sort of precarious work, reclassification, difficult to know who an employee is. On the other side, if you're looking at things outside of the corporation, right? And so, for example, Matt Bodie, I think it was a chapter or an article, wrote about the Volkswagen emissions scandal. And one of the things you're surprised is like, well, here's like a supposedly progressive German company with co-determination. How does something this long-standing and systemic and bad happen? Well, it's because actually there's a particular distortion where if you align the interests of the employees with the rest of the company, that really decreases the incentive for any type of whistleblowing, right? So it actually encourages not for managers and employees to collude against owners, right? Yeah. But employees to include with everyone else within the company for essentially anti-social means, right? So you could have a perfectly democratic, right, company, but because it's perfectly democratic, it has a unified interest against the outside world. So something, for example, like environmental damage, well, that's in everyone in the company's interests, right? And now it's in the employee's interest. It's going to be very difficult to monitor that type of behavior, right? So if you're the CPC and you're looking at these companies, they're just like, well, if we have an interest in companies doing things, right, that may not be in the interest of a unified democratic company. And so this is actually going to make that problem worse, right? So those are two just examples of two different things about modern conditions, right, that might militate against employee ownership. The second set of questions about this historical trajectory. So sort of know the story, sort of labor history and the CPC, some formal forms of factory participation during the 49 to 78 era. And then, we have some of these, like you mentioned, sort of partial privatizations that issue shares to employees, right? Most of those get bought out by other actors. But now that we sort of have this moment of like common prosperity, right? Why haven't we seen stronger forms of democratic management, right? So you mentioned, right, with the Minju Wong, that there's this ideas out there, but when it comes to corporate law or employee ownership, everything's sort of always optional, right? There's no mandates, right? It would seem, right, if these were things that were worth pursuing, the common prosperity era and the sort of the problems that's trying to solve, that we'd see a lot of mandates, right? This really does sort of like makes sense ideologically with how when we think about a socialist market economy. So why isn't there more of it? And then the second part of that is, there's, if you look at sort of the actual history of Chinese labor law as like actual enacted law, right? We have a lot of these traditional connections to Germany, and we may think about that. But in this area, and maybe this is just because it's an argument that I've made, isn't the US the better comparator, right? Because you mentioned like all these employee stock ownership plans start up largely in southern China, Huawei, ZTE, at the same time that it's sort of happening in Silicon Valley in the US, right? So, and at that time, there isn't any actual formal legislation. There's always catch up, right, at the local, provincial, and other areas. So it would seem that there's actually, when you look at like discussions about employee ownership, it's true because the German system is so different. You have independent, strong private labor unions. You have a co-determination system that for workers, the situation that employees have vis-a-vis their companies is closer in the US. And even like this idea of having financial participation then makes sense, right? Why it sort of grows up in these particular areas. So, in that sense, to sort of ask you to sort of defend, is Germany, the best comparator when thinking about this, or is it another place where employee ownership, right, without, again, a weaker private trade union system, right, makes it a better comparator in that context, right? So those are four sort of like bigger questions that you can take as you like.
Yeah. Thank you for I think that's thank you, Jed, for all these questions, and also I think there can be suggestions that I can improve my PhD thesis and also improve in my future research. I'd like to give some first reflection to your comments. So first, for those like the classification of employees. So exactly what employees they can participate in corporate management or in the employee stock ownership plans. So that's the first point. Okay, so for example, in China, that for the employee management participation, because we call it democratic management in the Chinese law, 民主管理. So the main body of the democratic management is the staff and workers representative congresses. Like they are responsible to elect employee representatives on the board of directors and the supervisory board. So those employee directors and employee supervisors, they are responsible for making decisions or to participate in corporate management. For the staff and workers representative congresses, they're responsible for electing those representatives. So in this case, we can see who can exactly participate in corporate management, that is staff and workers. So not the we call it 职工 in Chinese. And then for the form of the trade unions is how they can negotiate the better working conditions and better working welfare for their members. And in this case, there will be I would say there's also the staff and workers in the Chinese context in the form of trade unions. So the forms of management participation, that's the staff and workers, they could participate in this type of employee participation. And then for the employee stock ownership plans, especially the case that especially if we look at those announcements of the listed companies that they've announced that their directors, senior managers, they also participate in those ESOPs practice. So I would say that in the Chinese context, not only the ordinary employees, but also the managers, the directors, they could also participate in ESOPs. So when we talk about the Chinese context, indeed, we need to look into the different practices of management participation and financial participation, because like the management participation sometimes bear more political feelings of the party, and therefore it focuses more on the staff and workers. But for financial participation, it's also are part of the channel for the directors and the senior managers, that they could also share in the fruits of the business. So, so that's how the different groups of employees, they could participate in corporate management in the general picture. Okay, then and for the second point, that under different circumstances, the different groups of employees, they might have different interests. So therefore, all those employees that they might, well, of course, this is not that quickly that I could give a response for those different interests of the different group of employees. I think it's very interesting and important that, because I also look into the one empirical literature that actually through the ESOPs, that the corporation will have a better performance regarding environmental protection. So they will make a so that they could realize their environmental promises and to contribute to environmental protection. So I think that indeed infra participation can also generate some benefits for the environment and also for the society at large. But this is definitely a topic that worth future research. Yeah. And then also for the Chinese labor law, and also why I compare Germany, not the US. Well, in my first thought, that I would say that Germany has a relatively well-established legal framework for co-determination. And also, we know that China has learned a lot from Germany, and the practice of the Germany's practice also have been adopted in the European continent. So my first thought is like probably that China can also learn something from Germany at this time, especially for management participation. And then for the financial participation, especially for the employee stock ownership plans, well, because I also found in the case that in Germany, some companies, they will also grant the employees the right to the employee shareholders to participate in corporate management. They could also go into the shareholders meetings to make decisions. So this is also the case in China. So I think this is also the benchmark that I could compare the practices between China and Germany. And for the practice in the US, that I feel like, maybe I'm wrong, but could correct me. So I feel like it's more like the pension arrangements for the employees. So through the ESOPs, that employees, they could have a like a better financial guarantees for their life after retirement, and they have those tax benefits from the ESOPs. I think this is the case that it's a bit difficult to compare this practice with China, because that in China, it's the ESOPs is not in the direction of like the pension arrangement for employees, because it also bears some like the management arrangements between the corporations and the employees. So so in this case, I just compare the practice between China and Germany, so not the US. Yeah.
This is a short follow-up then, but this point about like common prosperity, why don't we see more mandates? Why is everything sort of recommendations and guidelines, right? It would seem like this would be, given the particular moment and the tensions and the motivations of common prosperity rhetoric, this would seem to be an ideal solution, right? Instead of saying you may have employee directors, right? You could say you must have, right? Instead of saying, you know, for example, Mexico, right? In the Mexican Constitution, it's mandatory to have profit sharing. Now, Mexican companies often use subcontracting and other ways of sort of getting around this, but it's like it's in the Constitution. Like we are we have the socialist history, we must have profit sharing, right? Or in Germany, right, again, there's lots of mandates. And lots of companies try to avoid this by incorporating as EU like companies, right? But still, there's like this is like something you can't get around. Why haven't we seen the same thing as a strategy in China?
Well, my interpretation is that China, actually we have those mandates for state-owned enterprises, but not for the private enterprises. So especially after the 1993 company law, that the state-owned companies, they must have employee supervisors. Then in the 2005 company law, that the state-owned companies, they must have employee directors. And still today, so I would say that it's more like the political practices in China. So I also mentioned that it's like we wanted to keep our promises to the working people, that once the CPC seized the power of the country, that the working people, they could participate in corporate management and to manage the country. So in this case, that it's mandated for the employees to participate in corporate management in SOEs, but not in private companies. So it's more like the different practices within China and other countries. So we have the mandate requirements, but not for all not for all companies, but for SOEs. And I think that but we can see the change in the company law that actually the first draft of the company law, it requires all companies with more than 300 employees must have employee directors. But in the final version and the official version that published in 2023, so it changed. So not all companies with more than 300 employees must have employee directors, but like the companies, they can have employee directors, so they changed it. Well, I didn't really know why, but I think it could be the case that at this point of time, it's still not that appropriate to mandate all companies to implement management participation or to implement board-level employee representation. But I hope in the future that we could have more mandate requirements for employee participation, so we could promote and we could improve employees' conditions and situations in their corporations.
Sounds like an interesting future paper.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I'm interested in your research methods. You include some field research or including mostly rely on
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in my PhD thesis, I actually I rely more on the public documents. I also conducted an empirical research. I used the regression analysis to examine whether the implementation of the ESOPs can enhance the total firm productivity in Chinese SOEs. So I included 52 SOEs in my empirical analysis, and then I found that the implementation of the ESOPs can enhance the total firm productivity of SOEs. And I've done this regression analysis. Well, I wanted to do the interviews. I wanted to ask some employees who participated in the ESOPs in some SOEs, but the point is that because I live in the Netherlands and it was a bit difficult for me to get interviewers, so I didn't really have the chance to get interview done. But in the future, I hope that I can reach out to some participants to do the interviews. Yeah, thank you.
Many future interesting papers. Yeah.
Sorry,
missed your talk. I was in another meeting and I was just rustled over. But I am in Hong Kong and I'm starting an employee participation platform. So just in case you had covered it, but so you can refer to it before, but I just wanted to see what would be your recommendations for such a platform, like best practices.
What kind of employee participation platform?
Aiming at the younger professionals, onboarding professional middle level leadership with help from senior leadership. So
So,
it's kind of a mentorship program within.
oh,
But the platform itself will recommend best practices for different organizations.
Well,
well,
we're a little bit past time, so maybe you guys can chat about that
Yeah.
afterwards in part,
Yeah.
because that's I think a different type of mechanism
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
than
yeah.
the one that we were
Yeah.
discussing earlier. But
indeed.
yeah,
Yeah,
but that's the but for right now, I think we have to go ahead and wrap things up. I want to thank Guotong again for presenting your work on a fascinating and sort of emergent area of law, and hopefully some of these other things we've discussed is something you can come back and present on in the future.
Yeah.
So
Thank you
thank you
very much.
again.
Thank you.